It's only like on the mic. Yeah, I know.
Hey. So at the end last time, we were discussing whether you thought it would be possible to identify a bunch of common sense about race. And some of us thought we might be able to, and some of you thought there wasn't enough consensus. But I want to just explore what might an approach you might take to characterizing our racial concepts that would work if we could characterize a bunch of shared common sense among speakers of the English language, or our dialect of the English language, about the word race. This strategy, by the way, for approaching questions of this sort, conceptual questions of this sort, was invented by a man called Frank Ramsey in the 1930s. And he invented it in order to think about a completely different philosophical problem, which was the question how you could understand what was going on, the concepts that related to the interior life of other people, what philosophers call the problem of other minds. You are directly aware of the fact that you have a mind because you have experiences, and you're aware of your experiences. You have second-order experiences of your experiences. But you don't have any direct experience of anybody else's mind. I know that I'm supposing that these intelligent eyes looking at me are seeing something, but I don't have any direct evidence of that. And what Ramsey did was to use this strategy that I'm going to now use to think about race to show how you could characterize concepts that were what's sometimes called theoretical concepts, but really unobservable concepts, by locating things that you can't directly detect in a network of the things you can detect. Okay, so that's just a historical sideline, and that's why this is called, what I'm going to do is called constructing a Ramsey sentence. But you didn't need to know that in order to see what's going on, but it's just interesting that that's why it was invented. All right. So this is a sampling of the sort of thing you'd presumably put together if you were trying to get some common sense about races. Right, and there'll be lots of them. Actually, we could probably generate 1,000 of them in the next 5 minutes, and we could probably generate 1 million of them if we kept going. So there's an awful lot of such things. So we assemble those. The process of constructing the Ramsey sentence for race goes like this. You assemble those. Then, since race is the thing you're puzzled about, you get rid of race. You just say, other Negro something or other. Right? So you don't rely on any prior understanding of the concept of race, because you aren't using the concept of race anymore. So this thing here would be what a logician would call a variable, because until you fill that in, this isn't a sentence, right? You have to fill it in with some value to make this a sentence. So there we are. Now, then we say that what people understand by the word race is captured, can be defined as the R, whatever it is, such that most of these sentences are true. Right? So you're going to find something in the world that meets all these conditions. You'll have found race. And Ramsey did this for some interesting, for example, Ramsey did this to measure degrees of belief, what psychologists and economists would call subjective probabilities. He showed how you could understand what subjective probabilities were by showing how they operate. All right. So this is the strategy. This is the Ramsey strategy. You need to assemble the common sense. You then remove the thing that you're trying to explain so that you're not presupposing anything about it, but any understanding of it. And then you say, well, race is whatever does all these things. If anything, of course. So you're now in a position to ask whether there are any races, because if there isn't an R such that, then there's nothing there. There isn't an R that meets all these conditions. Then there aren't any races. All right. So, in order to inquire as to whether there are any races, we've got two inquiries on our hands. First of all, we have to assemble these. We have to assemble the common sense. Right? And then we write the Ramsey theory, which says race is whatever meets the common sense. And then we have to identify the relevant disciplinary experts, the sociologists, biologists, medical doctors, whoever it may be, and see if, according to their theory, there is anything that meets these conditions. So you've got two things. You've got to try and get what it would have to be for there to be any races, and then you can go and see if there are any races by seeing whether anything that is recognized by current science or current something, current perhaps even common sense, meets those conditions. And that's the task, in a way, that what I was calling last time the ideational theory sets for us. Now, as you'll recall from the reading, so that's a kind of, the Ramsey sentence gives us a strategy for, which can be applied quite widely to many, many kinds of concepts, for saying what something is, and it tells us what we need to look for. We need to look for something, we need to find something about sub-Saharan Africans, what is makes them Negroes, whatever technical term we're using in our common sense, and so on. All right, that's the ideational task. But as you'll recall from the reading, the referential theory ends up in roughly the same place by way of a slightly different route. One version of the referential theory is based, as I argued, on the so-called causal theory of reference. The thought there is this. If you're trying to decide what a certain word means, say, Säuren, as uttered by a German chemist in the 18th century, right? If you look at German chemists writing in the 18th century, they'll talk a lot about Säuren. If you want to find what they're referring to, then you look and see not just what German chemists believed about them, which is what the ideational theory would suggest. So you could just go through German chemistry books, take out Säuren, put in S, and say Säuren is whatever S makes all those sentences true. Right? But as well, and this is what makes it a referential theory, a causal theory, you might also want to look in the world at the things that were around that led German chemists to talk about Säuren, right? So this is a Hobbly. What leads people to talk about Hobbly? Well, it turns out that if you put one of these in front of somebody, they say, "Oh, lo, the Hobbly." Right? So if we do that, the equivalent of that for Säuren, we look at German chemists, we see what was in their test tubes, what they described, what they did. They got a bit of mica and they got a bit of seawater, did various things, and we modern chemistry knowing people say, oh well, if you do that, you'll get sulfuric acid. And maybe Säuren means sulfuric acid. It doesn't, but that might be a start. All right, so now we'll find, if we do that, if we go looking for what prompted German chemists to talk about Säuren, or or to say of something, das ist eine Säure, that is a Säure, that, for example, when they tasted vinegar, whose main taste, as you probably know, comes from acetic acid, they said, Säure. And it turns out that if they tasted other acids, they also said, Säure. So one thing we can think is that maybe this word means acid, because the things that were around when they responded with acid talk are the things that we call acids. And we might, now of course, these chemists didn't have the concept of an acid that we have, right? These 18th century chemists. For one thing, they didn't have an atomic theory, so they certainly didn't have the idea that acids were proton donors, which is one standard way of explaining what an acid is these days, the so-called Bronsted-Lowry theory of acids. They didn't have our concept of acids, which focuses on the role of protons in chemical reactions and electrons going the other way. And they didn't have the concept of the proton, so they couldn't have had that idea. But still, they had beliefs about what they called Säuren, and many of them were true of proton donors. And of course, many of them were false, because German chemistry in the 18th century wasn't perfect. But we have now decided not that those German chemists were not referring to anything on the grounds that nothing meets the conditions, that all the things that they said about acids, that's true, nothing does. But that enough of the things they said about acids, about Säuren, were true of acids, and so we say they were referring to acids, even though they had some false beliefs about them, right? This method is focused then not so much on getting their beliefs right, but on getting right what it was in the world that caused them to use the word. That's what makes this a referential theory. It's trying to find what they were referring to, whether they really understood that they were referring to it or not, in the way that we do. So in the case of 18th century German chemists, we'd be assisted by the fact that in their communications with English chemists, the English chemists translated Säure into the English word acid. That might be a hint. But that isn't enough, because of course we might think that what 18th century people meant by the word acid in English was different from what we mean by it now. There are lots of words where that's happened, so we need to check. Now, as it happens, modern German chemists use the word Säure to refer to acids too, so this would not have been a very difficult inquiry for us, but still, even if they hadn't, we could have done what I said. But sometimes in the course of such an inquiry, collect what people thought they were talking about, and you look to see whether there's anything in the world like that. Sometimes we conclude that they weren't talking about anything, that there was nothing there. I don't know how many of you in this room think there are ghosts, but I don't. So whatever I think people are talking about, or were talking about when they talked about ghosts, I can't say what they were talking about was ghosts, because there aren't any. There's nothing for them to be talking about. But I can say a lot about what people have thought about ghosts. I can do the ideational stuff, but I can't do the referential stuff, because there's nothing in the world that does that, the ghost thing, according to me anyway. It's not my job to persuade you as to the existence or non-existence of ghosts. I'm just telling you how one would think if one didn't believe in them. So there are 18th century scientific words that are like that. One is phlogiston. Perhaps you've heard of phlogiston. Phlogiston in 18th century chemistry was, as the Encyclopedia Britannica says, the hypothetical principle of fire, of which every combustible substance was in part composed. So the idea was anything that can burn has some phlogiston in it. This is a theory about burning, right? Anything that was, and in this view, the phenomenon of burning, which we call oxidation, was caused by the liberation of phlogiston. So what was left was dephlogisticated substance, because the phlogiston had all gone. So ash is just dephlogisticated matter. That was their theory. Now, so when they pointed at flames, they would have said, look, there's the phlogiston coming off. That's what phlogiston looks like when it's leaving. And they would have said that's what trees look like when the phlogiston is gone, ash. Now, there's nothing, as I say, in contemporary physics and chemistry that behaves like that. Oxygen, which is central to combustion, is not given off. In fact, it's absorbed in combustion. So nothing is being given off of anything, something's being added. So that would make phlogiston a kind of negative substance if we said it was oxygen. So we can make sense of a lot of the talk about phlogiston. We can say what they believed about it, and this dictionary indicates that it doesn't believe what they believe by referring to it as something hypothetical, hypothesized. But there isn't any such thing, and so we don't. Whereas when German chemists in the 18th century talked about Säuren, we say they were talking about acids. What we say about phlogiston is when 18th century English chemists talked about phlogiston, they weren't talking about anything. They were mistaken, right? Now, of course, this procedure is going to leave us with unclear cases. A term in a foreign or past science refers to something if that thing provides a good enough explanation of why they use the term. But the idea of there being a good enough explanation is, of course, intrinsically vague and contested. Maybe some people think it's enough, maybe some people think it wasn't. So here's another example. Does the substance that the Azandi of North Central Africa call mangu, and which Evans Pritchard, the anthropologist who first wrote up their theory of the world in a wonderful book called Witchcraft, Oracles, and Magic Among the Azandi, which I commented, is a beautiful piece of anthropology done in the 1930s. He translated mangu into English as witchcraft substance. But let's just leave it as mangu, since we have the Ramsey strategy. And we can ask, is there anything like this? Right? Is there anything that's in the present in the body of witches that men get from their fathers and women from their mothers? This is because they had a general theory of inheritance that boys got most of their features from their fathers, and girls got most of their features from their mothers. That's why the girls are girls, boys are boys. That's one of the features of your father is bearing in your genetics. And so they thought that it was present in these bodies, that it was so the male witches were the sons of male witches, and female witches were the daughters of female witches. That witches had the capacity, as a matter of an act of will, to send the substance of their something called witchcraft soul. This is just the general word for soul, so the soul of mangu. That you can see it at night, visible as a flame, and it consumes the flesh of the people of the victims, and that's why they get sick or die. And mangu is visible sometimes as a flame. Also, it's visible in the bodies of their witches. With autopsy on the witch, you'll find the mangu in their belly. It's black substance in there. Right, so they had a theory of this. Evans Pritchard spent enough time there that he once wrote that sometimes of an evening, as he was falling asleep and he saw a flame passing through the edge of the village, he would say, "Oh, a witch, witchcraft substance." Then he would remember, "Oh, I'm not supposed to believe in that. I'm a good Catholic." So now, I don't suppose you believe in mangu. And one way of saying why is that you doubt that there's anything that has these properties. You don't think there's anything in the world like that, right? that sometimes there's a black substance in a belly and sometimes there's a flame on the edge of the village. You don't think there is anything like that. And so you don't believe in it. So what we feel, again, I mean, if you read the whole of Evans Pritchard's book, you'll get a really good idea of what they thought Mowgli was. There's an awful lot of stuff in there about that. So it's not that you can't understand what they were saying, but you understand it in a way that means you don't think they were talking about things. There's no such stuff. Now, I think in the reading I gave an example of animal spirits as used, did I? Yes. By Descartes. So Descartes in the Treatise on the Passions refers to animal spirits, and he says that what happens when, in cessation, for example, that animal spirits go from your hand and touch them up into your brain. And that when you move your hand, animal spirits come down into your brain to your hand. Now, there is something, I said we don't believe in that, but there is something that behaves like that, right? It's nerve impulses. That's a lot of what Descartes said about animal spirits is true about nerve impulses. So one way of talking about Descartes' Treatise of Passions, which is a very interesting early attempt at kind of neuroscience, explanatory neuroscience. One thing you could say about it is, well, what Descartes believed in, Descartes was in fact talking about nerve impulses. So a lot of what he says is true about nerve impulses, but of course he had a lot of beliefs about nerve impulses that are true. You don't know that nerve impulses pass down nerves because ion pumps pump ions back and forth through the membranes of nerves and so on, which is how they, as it were, actually work. I think one reason why people don't like thinking that Descartes could be referring to anything is they don't like the word spirit. That sounds like that doesn't sound like a biological word. But that's a prejudice. And spirit in at least in English, I mean, but it's in French or spirit in English time, could also be used to refer to things that definitely do have chemical existence, because we use the word spirits sometimes to refer to alcohol, and alcohol is part of the spectrum. It exists. So we shouldn't be. He's just saying that there's this stuff, a spirit in animals, and by the way, Descartes understood that what he was saying about our nerves was going to be true of the nerves of other animals. It wasn't just about humans. So we could say that in the Latin, it's written in Latin, so the word is spiritus. We could say that that was what he was talking about. He was talking about nerve impulses, and that's just meant to be an example of a case where you might go either way. You might say he wasn't talking about anything, or he was talking about nerve impulses, but of course he had a lot of false beliefs about them. So, all right, so those are just a few examples. Phlogiston, Zongu, and the spirits of applying this strategy in ways that I think make sense. Right? You understood what I was saying about how to think about those cases. We're just applying this to the race concept. So what I said about all this in the reading was that as a practical matter, at least three things are required in order for us to allow that a past theorist who spoke of something was badly mistaken, but was nevertheless talking about something real, right? First, we have to believe in X. We have to think there are X's, right? So that's the existence. Second, some of what was thought to be true of Y is approximately true or true of X. So you can't succeed in talking about something if everything you believe about it is false. You've got to have some true stuff. We can't even begin to try and identify what you're talking about, except by trying to find something that you might have been talking about. And if there's nothing, if there's nothing true. If none of your beliefs are true, then we can't do it. And third, an important condition, the uniqueness condition, X has to be the best candidate for being widespread. Because it might be that there were a bunch of things, because if you took some of these, they've got some false beliefs and they've got some true about X, but they've got some false beliefs, some true beliefs about Z, right? And we have to decide whether it's X or Z. Well, maybe X and Z are just equally good candidates. So they weren't talking about one thing, they were talking about two things, or nothing. Since they refused to fail. There are famous examples in history of the sciences of this sort of thing, where people had theories of two things, the other way around. There are people who had theories of two things which turned out to be one thing. The most famous of these, I suppose, is well, no, I think that's most famous. One of the most famous in history of astronomy is Hesperus and Phosphorus, which were the names of the two. Well, they were factors of that, and they were in the stars. Why should they call it facts? Because that's the Greek word for planet, just means a wandering star. That's a star. So they called Hesperus and Phosphorus. They called them the morning star and evening star. In many European languages, German, one was called Morgenstern and one was called Abendstern. All right. Turns out they're both Venus. It's Venus seen in the morning, they call the morning star, and Venus seen on the dusk edge of vision, they call the evening star. But turns out those are the same thing. But to know that, you have to be able to trace the path of Venus during the day when it's not visible, and that requires orthogonals for them. So anyway, so sometimes you want to say, well, they were talking about one thing, even though they thought they were talking about two things. Sometimes you want to say, well, there's two equally good candidates for what they were talking about, and so we don't really know what to say. So, all right. Now, built in to the way I've been proceeding is an idea, which is that there are people we could go to, experts, who could tell us whether there's anything that meets the existence, adequacy, and uniqueness conditions, right? And that will depend on what kind of thing the X is, of course, right? So and that involves a phenomenon called, which the American philosopher Hilary Putnam called semantic deference. What is semantic deference? Yes. So you read the example. Good. Did everybody hear that? No? Would you mind saying it a bit louder? Can you just repeat that? Yes, all right, I'll repeat what he said. He said it's the practice of using a concept, he said, gave the example of electricity, where we leave it to the experts to figure out what the stuff really is. So I can talk about electrons. I think there are electrons hopping back and forth between different energy levels in these lamps, which is why we got light here. Photons are released when electrons do that. That's what I think. But I'm no physicist. And if you ask me, well, how do you know that? I would say somebody told me. And then you would say, well, suppose they were wrong. And I would say, well, I would go and check. And I know how to check. I go and find a physicist. I say, is that the right account? And then I ask them why they believe it. And they tell me stories about experiments, theories, and so on. And I become convinced. So, suppose when I was your age, when I was an undergraduate, first year undergraduate actually, I was a medical student and I went to see my doctor to introduce myself because I was the doctor in the town where my university was. And I picked the one closest to my college and I went in to see him. And we had a chat and then I went away. And a few days later I came back and said, I'm feeling a bit tired. I'm wondering if I have something. He said, you're a medical student, right? So you've probably just been told about some disease, and all young medical students always think they've got everything they ever hear about. So you do. So he said, what do you think you have? I said, mononucleosis. He said, okay. I don't think you have mononucleosis, but there is a test for mononucleosis. So if you like, I'll take some of your blood and you can take it down to the lab to study check. I'm not interested in that because I know you don't. He was the expert on mononucleosis. I was hoping to become one. And if you asked me, should I believe that mononucleosis is sometimes called the kissing disease because it's transmitted by kissing. If you want to know what the truth about the kissing disease, I suggest you ask a doctor. I don't think you should ask an expert on kissing, whoever that might be, somebody on OnlyFans perhaps. So you've got to find the right expert. But once you find the right expert, then you say, look, if there's any doubt about this, that's my team. And of course, it's not one expert, it's a community of experts. It's a scientific community. So I think we do this a lot. We use all kinds of concepts that I don't really have a deep understanding of what an electron is. But I can talk about electrons because the words, the central truths of the word are in the hands of a community of people who know what they're talking about, namely physicists and chemists. Okay, so now we don't just do this with science. I teach in a law school. I know better than to think that just because two people have written an agreement on a piece of paper and signed it, they have a contract. I would go to a lawyer and ask, have they done whatever is necessary to make it a contract? And they might well not have. I mean, for one thing, in Anglo-American contract law, to make a contract binding, there has to be something called consideration. Something has to do something to pay for it. Have you ever heard the expression peppercorn rent? Probably not. That's a very low rent, and the idea was that if you wanted to bind someone in a rental contract and you didn't want very much money from them, you asked them for a peppercorn. That was enough for there to be legal consideration, and so the contract was much money. All right, so the experts on whether you've got a contract are lawyers, and it can turn out that there are things that for example, any deals you make with Russian or Italian or any other kind of mafia that involve doing things that are illegal, those are not enforceable. Those are not really contracts. They're not legally enforceable. The mafia will enforce them, but not the courts. So we defer all the time to all kinds of experts. We defer to lawyers. We defer to very many different kinds of scientists, and so on. All right, so semantic deference means that I can say, I just signed a contract for my next book. What I say is true, even though I'm not entirely sure how to explain what a contract is in a way that a lawyer. Right? And the same is true about electrons when we're talking about lights and so on, or when we're talking about acids and I say something's a proton donor. I have a vague idea of that. I have a vague idea of why that's got something to do with hydrogen. I have a vague idea about that, and so on. But I can still talk about hydrogen and proton donation and so on without being an expert on how the terms really work. And that's because we, as I say, we practice semantic deference. So among the Zandi, there were witch finders. people who found witches, and they were the experts. If you wanted to know whether someone was really a witch, you went to a witch finder, and the witch finder consulted an oracle. They had 3 levels of oracles, very elaborate system of oracles, and if the oracles agreed, there were 2 possibilities. One is, if the oracles agreed they weren't a witch, there were 2 possibilities. One was they weren't a witch, and the other was they were a very strong witch who could interfere with an oracle. So what is that? Two possibilities. Anyway, all right. So I've given you the example of electron and contract, and a sort of jocular example of witchcraft substance. Let's see if we would want to do semantic deference for other kinds of terms, and forget about electron. Cat. Want to engage in semantic deference about cats? You are aware that there are, perhaps you're not aware, it'd be better if you were, that there are members of the cat genus that you've never heard of, don't look as much like either lions or pussycats, so that you might not recognize them. So maybe we ought to defer to zoologists about that. We can use the word in everyday life, and it refers to pussycats, is no problem. But to come across something cat-like, maybe the right person to ask about whether it's really a cat. I mean, many people. Is a fox a cat? Is a fox a dog? You don't know. Or what? Have to ask the zoologists how closely related cats and foxes are, in order to decide. The most famous example of this sort of thing, of course, is the word fish. Right? If you read the King James Bible, the thing that swallows up, who's the guy who was swallowed by a fish? Jonah. Yeah, Jonah. The thing that swallows up Jonah is in the English James translation Bible is called fish. So that means that in Renaissance England, they thought that whales were fish. And in fact, lots of people did. The Nordic word for a fish is fish. I mean, for a whale, is fish. So they obviously thought whales were fishes, so they put fish into the name. But they're not fish. And why do we know this? Because classification biologists have identified them as mammals. And they're not. The only thing they have in common with fish is they live in the sea. That they have lungs. This is why they come up to breathe from time to time, and fish can stay under the water all the time. And so on. All right. So in this, I recommend that you treat cat like that when it comes to talking about exotic cats. Right? I recommend that you think that there's a good reason why the zoologists have classified some of those animals as cats and some of them as not. There's a reason why they call cats, they're called lions and tigers, and domestic cats, cats. It has to do with their evolutionary history and the fact that they're evolutionarily related. In fact, lions and tigers are close enough that they can breed to produce tiles and ligers, which is what crossbreed is called. Horses and donkeys are different. Donkeys are horses, but donkeys and horses can reproduce. There's mules. So a mule is a cross between 2 species. It's not fertile, so that's why it's not a species itself, because the species has to be able to reproduce itself. All right. Anyway, that's the sort of thing as zoologists would say in explaining why. What about table? Are there experts on table? Who would they be? Okay, so carpenters, woodworking. Sounds, yeah, okay. So, but suppose you went to a carpenter and said, I'd like you to make me a table, and they come back with something, you say, that's not a table. And the carpenter says, I'm the expert at what's table. What's table? How would you feel about that? A different thing. If that's a table, I don't want it. Yes. But you might also say, look, table's just an ordinary everyday word, and everybody's in charge of tables. So you don't need to defer about tables. Person is very much an everyday word. But in the age of LLMs, we're beginning to think about how to tell whether something is a person. And we're worried that we don't know. We're worried, that is, that we don't know what it would take for a sufficiently complex artificial intelligence to count as a person, not as a human being, of course. We know it's not a human being, but that's because the zoologists will tell us it's not a human being. What's a person? I mean, and now we have ideas, we have sophisticated ideas about personhood, right? So, for example, at least in the standard case, a person has to be at least sometimes conscious. The psychological person. So, if something's never conscious, it might be a human body, but if it's never conscious, it doesn't have, suppose, so take an anencephalic infant born without a brain. Right? It's never going to be a person, right? It doesn't have the physical substrate of personhood, which involves having a brain and a mind. Now, of course, in order to know that, you have to know that there's a connection between having a brain and having a mind. And that's not obvious. Not everybody has known that always. In a lot of older languages, the talk about the mental life refers to things in the breast, in the chest, right? And that suggests that they thought that that was the seat of intelligence and feeling. And maybe there is a sense in which something in here is the seat of feeling, because when your stomach is upset, that's kind of one of the physical bases of certain kinds of emotions. But anyway, the point is, on the one hand, we have lots of ideas about personhood, and on the other, I'm not sure that we're secure in thinking either how to tell in every case, or, importantly for this purpose, who's the expert? Who gets to decide whether an AI is a person for whatever purposes? Lawyers will get to decide whether AIs are legal persons, right? They will get to decide whether you can sue an LLM. And unless we change the law, they'll decide you can't, because it doesn't have any property for you to sue. But the owner of the LLM does, but not the LLM itself. But anyway, all right. So, so these ideas about ideational stuff and referential stuff and semantic deference, right, which we've developed without saying very much about race, are used in what you read to think about the transition over the last few centuries in thinking about race in the North Atlantic world of Europe and the Americas, North America. All right. So, and the argument was that neither the ideational route by way of the Ramsey theory, nor the causal theory of reference way allowed you to find anything in the world that actually meets the conditions for being a race. And so there aren't any, right? That was the argument. So, but how did we decide that? Well, to decide whether there are races from the ideational point of view, we had to get the materials for the Ramsey theory of race, which I started with today, right? All that common sense stuff about race. So that's an inquiry about English speakers. How do people talk about race in English? Remember, we can't assume that the words that we typically translate as race to English and Portuguese for Brazil, or English and French in France, or race in France, race in Portuguese, race in German. We can't be sure that they're using them in exactly the same way as we are, but English speakers are in charge of how we use the word race. And so we need to find competent English speakers and ask them how they think the word should be used. And then, of course, we then need to figure out whom to defer to in order to settle the question whether there is anything like that. On the referential view, the issue is perhaps a little bit trickier. Is there anything in current science that fits into a causal story about how the word race came to be used? Is there something that still exists? We'll consider various candidates, subspecies, for example, that still we believe in. And if that's what was around when people started talking about races, then on the referential view, that's what they were talking about. And so if the best current science says there are subspecies, then there are races on that view, right? Yes? Good. So I want to move quickly now to pick up a few points. Sorry, that's the framing for what's going to be a longish discussion over the next few weeks, where we look at the relevant general science and ask ourselves the question and how it relates to the way people ordinarily talk about it, and ask whether there's enough in the science, there's something that the science talks about that's substantial enough that we might say, okay, the best account of what race is that. Yes.
So this essentially combines the ideation of referential account of race.
No, I was suggesting we could do it from both points of view.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
it's a hybrid.
Yes, yes. I mean, the ideational strategy is going to require us to do something that the referential strategy is going to require us to do as well, which is to ask the scientists what there is, right? And then to ask, was any of that around when people started talking about race? I mean, the model here is the model for referential accounts of meaning is actually an account of words that we don't ordinarily think of as having a meaning at all, namely names. When I ask you, what does Samantha mean? I may be asking about some historical reason why the name is B. But what I really want to know, if I'm going to use the word, which the word refers to, right, in our. And if you want to know about a word from long ago, who, if anyone, it refers to, then you're going to have to do some history. Right. Who does the word Moses that's used in the Torah refer to? Right? Well, you just have to do some ancient history to figure out. Maybe you can't figure out. Maybe there wasn't any such person. So about Jesus, right? There are people who think there was no such person, that these are confabulation, made up stories developed in the first century in Palestine at a time when there were many people claiming to be the Messiah, and it's a sort of mixture of stories put together. So if we could go back to the moment when Moshe, or whatever the ancient Hebrew for Moses is, was first used, we could find a moment of what the great philosopher of the Project 450 called the moment of baptism. Because obviously he's Jewish, he's used to say that classic all that stuff. The moment when the name is put on something, right? So a child is born, It's not magic how it gets its name. Somebody has to give it a name. And that person has to have the authority to name the child. Usually that's the parents. In most societies, but not always. All right. So, but this is this sort of picture that I'm sketching here of how you might investigate the existence of something is going to be in the background as we go through discussing all these scientific theories in the weeks ahead. And we're going to look at different sciences. We're going to look at biology, classification biology. We're going to look at sociology. We're going to look at a bunch of sciences. But let me just finish off just reminding you of some of the relevant history. So in the first stage, which I represented with Thomas Jefferson, our one-time president, founder, drafter of the Declaration, 250th anniversary we're celebrating this year. But importantly, an important American intellectual of this period, and wrote about these things in the Notes on the State of Virginia, for example. And race is the concept in his writing that's used to explain cultural and social phenomena, such as something that Jefferson believed in, which is that it wasn't possible for people of different races to share common citizenship, which is why he hoped that the last population of the United States would go back to Africa. But that alleged incompatibility was derived, he thought, from the physical and psychological natures of the races. So, and that isn't exactly a biological concept because, for one thing, the word biology doesn't exist at this point. But it's a concept that's close to biological because it focuses on properties inherited in people's bodies. Jefferson thought that many of the differences between black and white people could be explained by inherited difference, not just skin color, which obviously could be explained in part by inheritance, though there was no agreed theory of the inheritance of skin color in the 18th century. It's actually one of the great scientific questions of the 18th century is the origin of skin color. Anyway, Jefferson died 200 years ago, July 4th, believe it or not, 1826. And so he's our first thing because he carries us from the 18th into the 19th century. And he's already in a transition beyond the Humean picture in which the bodily stuff is much less important. In the Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson talks a lot about bodies, black bodies and white bodies, and the bodies of what he called Indians, Native Americans. Second phase, represented for us by Matthew Arnold and Hippolyte Taine, two great literary theorists of the 19th century. Arnold also one of the great English poets of the period. And in this period, the idea that you're going to explain the science to which people refer when they're looking for explanations of the differences between the races, between the human races, is increasingly biology, which already is a serious science by the time these guys are writing. And so when they are pushed, they engage in semantic deference to the scientists. You push these guys on race, they'll say, well, it's what the scientists say. Especially Arnold. Taine, a bit more complicated, but even though he's deferring to the biologist, he's theorizing about cultural styles as different in different races. And he thinks it's because of their races that they have different cultural styles. So you must, in some sense, think that cultural style is determined by your inheritance, what you inherit, as it were, in your body. So he's what I call the racialist. He thinks that you can divide human beings into a small number of human groups, whose members share certain fundamental heritable characteristics that are physical as well as moral, intellectual, and cultural, that they don't share with members. That's what distinguishes the races. So they have some that the other races don't have. Now, these fundamental properties constitute an essence. Arnold uses the word seed or germ. These are other biological metaphors. But the idea is that there's something implanted in every person of a certain race that is the same as the thing implanted in everybody else of that race, and that's why the people of the race are similar to each other. They have the same seed or germ or essence in them, right? So now they're often stated rather vaguely as sort of tendencies. So one of them, Arnold gave some famous lectures on the poetry of the Celts, the Welsh and Irish, and he says in there that the Celtic race tends to be sentimental. Part of the Celtic essence. And it's part of the German essence to be efficient. Now, why is he talking about this? Well, sentimental, because he's talking about poetry, and he's suggesting that that's why Celtic poetry is, in his view, sentimental. It's not because they passed on a culture of sentimentality, it's because they're a sentimental lot. Now, the trouble is that what Arnold says about the races he discusses, Celts, but also Saxons, as in Anglo-Saxon, Indo-Europeans, which is Aryan, so people from South Asia all the way through Europe, all related by ancestry, he thinks. Semites, so that's Arabs and Jews. A lot of what he says about these cases don't actually fit very well with his picture, the racialist picture. And in fact, his knowledge of the actual development of peoples leads him into trouble, because he is trying to work this theory, because he has to defer to the scientists. And we can exemplify the sort of trouble he gets in by considering what he says about the character of your favorite people, the French. So here's the quoted passage. How little the triumph of the conqueror's laws, manners, and language, how little the triumph of the conqueror's laws, manners, and language proves the extinction of an old race, we may see by looking at France. Gaul, which is what the Romans called the area of Europe that we call most of the area that we call France, though famously Cicero, at the beginning of the Gallic Wars, his book on his wars in Gaul, says that Gaul is divided into three parts. But anyway, that's the first sentence, I think. He says Gaul, that area, was Latinized in language, manners, and laws, and yet her people remained essentially Celtic. Well, how are we to understand that? So if I say, oh, well, the Celts are sentimental, but the French are sentimental. Oh, you say that's because they were Latin. Well, but then, as it were, you can explain anything. They can be anyway. You will say, well, sometimes it's because they were their racial essence, and sometimes it's because they've been Latinized. So his point is that even though the French speak a language derived from a form of Celtic influence Latin, that's the ancestry of French, the so-called Sermo Vulgaris, as it was called in the past, they're still racially Celts. So the Gauls, right? Some of you will have heard of this Gaul, Asterix Gaul. favorite cartoon subject with French cartoons. Asterix. The Gauls were indeed close relatives of the Celts, the Welsh, and the Irish on the British Isles, and they were Latinized in language when Transalpine Gaul was conquered by the Romans, who gradually replaced the Celtic language, Gaulish, with Latin. And that process continued when the Romans were defeated and replaced by the Franks, who came in from further north and east. East. The Franks spoke a Germanic language, though their language of government was also a form of Latin. So modern French derived from, as I said, something called Sermo Vulgaris, Latin with Celtic influences, itself shaped by the Latin language, which replaced Frankish by the 9th century in what is now France. So there's a muddle here, because if the Gaulish and the Frankish essences are so opposite, what is it to inherit both those essences? What is it to inherit both of them? There are at least two problems that were never solved by this approach. Problem one, if you're serious about this, how does the inheritance of essences work? What are the laws of the inheritance of essences, right? And the second problem, how does the inherited essence interact with the environment to produce the actual character of the group or of the individual? Now, they were struggling with these problems at this time, the time that Arnold was writing. He was struggling with them because he was writing about poetry, but the scientists were struggling with them, the biologists, the scientists. And they solved these problems by rejecting this picture. It's one thing the scientists could do, develop a new picture. And that new picture, of course, is the one that you get when you combine Darwin with Mendel, roughly, when you combine two of the greatest theories in modern biology, Darwin's theory of evolution and natural selection, and Mendel's theory of inheritance. Now, you know, on that approach, there aren't any racial essences, right? There are genes, and every organism has a lot of them. I mean, even E. coli, tiny bacteria has a lot of them, but we have tens of thousands of locations on our genome. And that picture not only rejects the idea of racial essence, but it treats most of the sorts of things that Arnold was trying to explain as things not to be explained by genes, but by cultural history, working on the biological basis of a human psychology that is in its broad outlines the same everywhere. And while psychologists study individual variation in human beings, even genetic variation, they think that most of the variation is found everywhere. That is to say, and there's a reason for that, which I'll come back to from time to time. I will introduce it for the first time now, which is that, as we now all know, our species is descended from populations that were in Africa before Homo, the genus Homo, spread. And a few mixed with other hominids that also left Africa a bit earlier. But the basic source of our ancestry is these Africans who left 100, 200,000 years ago from Africa. And if you think about it, that means that most of the extra-African human population is a sampling of the African. Right? There's only some people left. So only some of the genes left. For all the genes to leave, everybody would have to go, and they didn't. So you get, and that's why one of the most obvious consequences of that is that Africa remains today the place with the largest variance in human in its genome. There's lots and lots of genes. Almost all the genes found outside Africa are found in Africa, but lots of genes that aren't found outside are also found in Africa. So Africa, and that's what you'd expect if a population evolves by spread from a center, then you'd expect the biggest variance to be in the center because the rest, as I said, is a sampling. Now, of course, it's central to the modern view of these things that there's also mutation. So another source of variance in the whole human population is mutation, and some of those mutations occurred outside Africa, didn't occur in Africa. So those genes aren't in Africa. Well, most of them are now in Africa, but that's because Europeans came back. But so the key point in the materials in the rest of the reading for the third section of the course is the argument that once you see the Darwinian picture of how human variation arises and then add in the Mendelian account of how human biological differences are transmitted across generations, you see that there can't be anything that behaves the way racial essences are supposed to behave. And the key thing, I think, is not that there are no inherited characteristics that are of cultural significance, of course there are, but that there's almost as much variation within the so-called races as there is across them. Genetic variation. As the second UNESCO statement of scientific experts on race, anthropologists and biologists, inviting us to defer to the experts, said in 1951, the scientific material available to us present does not just include between the cultures and cultural achievements of different peoples or groups. It does indicate, on the contrary, that a major factor in explaining such differences is the cultural experience which each group has undergone. Now, this is old science. This is 1951 science. We'll talk about some more recent science. But a lot of contemporary scientists who work on the human genome would agree roughly with this statement. But we'll talk about that in more detail. And certainly, so you shouldn't accept this just because a bunch of scientists said it in 1951 at a conference. That's not but it is a fact, as I say, that most people who work on these things these days still seem to think that something like this is true. So if semantic deference is based on the idea that it's rational to give strong weight to the opinions of experts, then anyone who's semantically deferring in their use of the words race, supposing, like Arnold, that there are experts, then you'll care not just that they said this, but that they also said that they did think there were races, though there was no scientific consensus on how to draw the boundaries between them. So these people said this, but they also said, we do think there are races, biological races. Now, I was denying that in this, in what I wrote, and that's because on the matter of race, I do not defer semantically to scientists. I think there's other things to be said, there are philosophical things to be said, which can lead you to think that the scientists are making a mistake or confused, some of them. But we'll talk about all that later. Now, as you're probably aware, there are lots of people who don't believe this. Right? There are lots of people who think, yeah, the main reason the Chinese are doing so well in the world today is because they are genetically superior, or whatever, whatever your favorite successful group is. Singaporeans are terrifically successful sampling of the genome of China, that sort of thing. There are people who think things like that, as I understand. But so let me end by just making a point that about a confusion that sometimes underlies this form of thinking. So many psychologists have argued that psychological traits are heritable. That is, some of your psychological traits are, to some degree, causally fixed by the sampling of the psychological genes that you got from your mum and your dad. Given that psychological traits arise from features of our brains, and many of those features are genetically shaped, I don't think a reasonable person would want to deny that that could be true. It's very likely to be true, in fact. But many people assume that if a trait is heritable, and if two groups differ in that trait, then the explanation must be hereditary. Many people think that if you've got two groups and they differ in a heritable characteristic, then it must be that the explanation of the difference is hereditary. Maybe you think that. I'm going to try and persuade you that that's wrong. So, the technical ways we measure heritability are, is basically the ratio of variance, which is a measure of statistical spread of values, in a characteristic in an environment. The variance due to the environment and the variance due to genes. So what proportion of the total variance is genetic and what proportion is not? The heritability of height in the United States, in India, and in the human population in general is big. It's highly heritable. Height is highly heritable. Tall people tend to have tall children, shorter people tend to have shorter children. There's a general regression to the mean phenomenon, which means that very short people are going to have children probably taller than them, and very tall people are probably shorter than them. But there's a strong correlation between parental height. But that interpopulational difference, here's an example of that interpopulation. South Asians in India and, just like Indians in India and Americans in America, let's take the whole population, have a different average height. Right? There's a significant difference in average height. But the explanation for that is almost entirely due to differences in nutrition. If you take, and in fact, we could confirm this because it's true about the Japanese population of the United States, that while the population of Japan is not as tall on average as the population of Europe, the population of Japanese Americans is the same, roughly. The average height of Japanese Americans is about the same as the average height of everybody else. So it's a difference that's due to the different ways people eat in different places. Now there are some do you know who the tallest nation in Europe is? The Dutch. The average Dutch male adult is 6 foot plus. The average female is 5'9" or 5'10". So that, and last time I was in Holland, this is very striking to me. You set off the plane, there's all these huge people. It's an interesting question whether that's because they eat what they eat, or because they actually are, to a significant degree, population that for some reason has been selected for height. But my point is, it's not the case that it can't be true that there's a genetic explanation for difference, but it doesn't follow from the fact that the difference is an heritable characteristic that the explanation for the difference between two populations is genetic. Is that clear? I mean, again, you could do this very, very simply. Take some seeds of anything, any farm. Plant some of them in a pot over here in the sunlight, and some of them over here in a pot in the dark. Do you think that, and feed them the same food? Do you think that they will all end up the same average height as they're genetically ran themselves? No. So when we see differences between populations that in characteristics that are in fact plausibly heritable, it doesn't follow that the reason for the difference is genetic. Good. I'm actually caught up. So we have 1 minute for any urgent questions, and then we'll go on next class with the reading as was set out for the next 2 classes. Remembering that we do not have a class next Monday because we are celebrating our presidents. It's President's Day. We have a meeting on Tuesday instead because Tuesday is a legislative Monday, as they say. We're going to pretend that next Tuesday is a Monday. So you have a long weekend ahead of you. Enjoy it. Thank you. Just a sec, I just want to stop the recording.
As my grade. So I